Hey everyone, welcome to Penny's Mind Files Method, the podcast showing you where the off ramp to the healing highway is when you're stuck on the life sucks road that goes nowhere. So, we're already at the 20th episode, and I probably never told you before, but I'm like sales and marketing is not one of my strengths. So, it never occurred to me that the look of my podcast should match the look of my social media. But, marketing experts tell me that consistency is best. And preferred by the public. I don't know. You guys can let me know if you prefer everything to look all the same or not. But anyway, for those of you, I know some of you are just listening to this, but for those of you who watch it on YouTube or Rumble, now the whole look is going to be just slightly different. Some of the slides and the colors and things are going to be different. It's actually, even on my social media, everything is going to be different. Which reminds me to tell you that you can also find me by searching on Facebook. You can find me by my name, which is Penny Hodgson. You'll see that it's an author, that I'm an author and a digital creator. If you look for me on Facebook and on Instagram, I managed to get the Penny's Mind Files handle. So you can find me on Instagram and YouTube and Rumble with Penny's Mind Files. Hopefully that makes it easier for y'all to find me in all the different places. And yeah, let me know what you think about the new color schemes. So, in this episode, we're going to look at accusations and what to do when somebody hurls one towards you. So, one example that I'm going to use is the accusation of being jaded. It's a common one, so it's worth digging into. I can't tell you how many times people have accused me of being jaded for one reason or another. And that's people who kind of know me. Of course, they think they know me better than they do. And people who know me through work, which means they don't know me at all, right? They're acquaintances at best. They see my professional face, my temperament, and my work knowledge that's related to whatever job I'm doing, but work's what I do and not who I am. Have you heard the saying that you don't know somebody until you live with them? It's true, right? Because when you live with somebody, eventually all of their perceived flaws are going to come to the forefront. They're going to be revealed. The insecurities and the fears and the vulnerabilities. And it's all the things that we hide about ourselves. We don't want people to know, even your best friend, right? But when you live with somebody, things happen in life where you're not able to control those filters, like of what you allow people to see, and then the truth is revealed. Now, you live with yourself all the time. Do you know who you are? Really? That might sound like a crazy question, right? But when we're looking at life through all of these past emotional filters that are attached to narratives that we created in our childhood, all of which are vibrating way below neutral at the bottom of the emotional filter frequency scale, we're not really living authentically because we're living in a fear based world. So, for example, if you get triggered by an accusation, somebody says, "Hey, you're just jaded," you're still learning who you are. And that's okay. I mean, that's the whole point of the Mind Files method is to help you figure out who you are. Right? Every episode is trying to give you ideas on how you do that. What's in the files in the filing cabinets of your mind, and to show you how to go about reassessing the narratives to see if they're still relevant and if you should keep them or resolve them. So, when people are communicating with one another, they're having a conversation. It's really common, right, to hear criticisms of people, of things, of events, whatever, judgments. People make judgments all the time, right? Things about what's going on in your community, what's going on in the world, I mean, people are constantly criticizing other people's behavior and things that are going on, right? So Also, during conversation, people are going to make random comments about all kinds of things. That's all part of a conversation. But if somebody makes a comment during conversation that you interpret as an accusation, if they say something and then you take it to heart, if you get triggered by it, then that's an indication that there's a wound, a past wound that needs healing. In other words, you have an unresolved mind file that needs attention. So, for example, let's say you're having a conversation with your friends about trauma recovery, and all your friends are aware that you grew up in a home with high levels of dysfunction. And you say something like, people tend to use generational trauma as an excuse to be abusive themselves. And then somebody in the conversation says, you're just saying that because you're jaded. And right away, you get triggered. Your heart starts racing, and your body, you feel hot. And your personal energy appears to be running high because you're instantly angry, and immediately you start defending yourself. Your tone of voice and your body language is telling everybody around you exactly how you feel. But here's the thing. The person who accused you of being jaded, they didn't inflict that wound. The wound was already there. Your mind's process just referenced the mind file that houses a bunch of harsh criticisms that you were given as a child. It reminded you of an old wound, and you reacted as if it was a new wound. The overreaction you have as an adult is normal because then as an adult, you're aware of power structures, whereas as a kid, you weren't aware of that. So the reaction to defend yourself is usually over the top because as a child, right, you were defenseless. You're powerless as a child. You're at the mercy of everybody around you. But once you're grown, well, you're just not ever going to let anyone make you feel that way again. But like I've said many times before, there's no defiance in love because you're sending out and receiving through thick emotional filters that are dealing with pride and anger and fear and grief and shame and guilt. So if you get triggered, you haven't learned how to love yourself yet. You might not even know yet who you really are, but that's okay. You can start learning now. I know how you feel because before I resolved the mind files in my own filing cabinets, and especially the ones that dealt with self worth, the microsecond that somebody suggested that I was jaded, my mind's process had already put me in defense mode, which immediately dropped my energetic output way below neutral. I just didn't know it at the time either. I had emotional filters attached to all kinds of narrative that dealt with pride and anger and shame and guilt. I know now that my reaction was a child's reaction because I hadn't healed those fear files yet. The ones that housed all the narratives that where I was criticized all those years and blamed, and all the accusations that people assigned to me as a child, those are all getting referenced, and I hadn't healed them. I talk about all of that in my memoir, Aces High. So, what happens in a conversation is as soon as you start to defend yourself, whoever accused you also feels the need to defend themselves from your aggression. Now you're engaged in an argument, which triggers all the lower resonating files for both of you. And all of those files are the ones that hold guilt and shame and grief and fear, right? All the way at the bottom. The argument puts both of you way down at the bottom of the emotional filter frequency scale. And that energy permeates the whole table. So now everybody that's sitting there is starting to feel uncomfortable. Well, that's as far away from being compassionate and understanding as you can be, right? It's kind of like two wrongs trying to make a right. Now, in the last episode, we talked about bullying and how fast the mind's process references old wounds, which causes us to react rather than assess the current situation from an adult perspective. If you haven't listened to that or watched that episode yet, then I encourage you to do so. Accusations and critical comments trigger the same kinds of mind files because bullying, while it's technically homes that have high levels of dysfunction, tend to have parents who are highly critical as opposed to genuinely supportive. And the narratives that a child creates from chronic criticism are really similar to the ones that they create from bullying. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing because constant criticism is a kind of bullying, isn't it? It's parental bullying, but it's different than peer bullying. So, how is that? Parental bullying, the relationship between a child and parent, that's very different than a relationship between two kids that go to school together. Parents are supposed to love you unconditionally. We talked about that in episode 18. Recognizing that a child's idea of what unconditional love is more about receiving comfort than understanding what love actually is. If you think about it, many adults have no idea what genuine love is either because they've never stopped to think about it. Most people accept definitions of things like love that are given to them by other people. They don't really reassess those definitions unless something happens in their life that causes them to ask the question. So, for example, if somebody had, I don't know, multiple failed marriages, then they might start asking, hey, like, what am I really looking for? What is love to me? So the other thing that we haven't spent like a lot of time talking about, or any time talking about really, is context and personal definitions. So in episode 3, I introduced kind of the power of words. And if you haven't listened yet to that episode, and episode 3 is only audio, there are no visual aids for the first 10 episodes because, yeah, I don't know why I didn't do that. But anyway, I encourage you to go back and listen. Really, you should listen to all of the previous ones and then work your way up because the more you listen, the better, the easier this whole method gets. Um, so, so when somebody accuses you of being jaded, like, how do we know that we know what they mean? See, everybody immediately goes to their own definition, their own understanding of what jaded is. And it's going to be tied to a threat of some kind, right? But the person who's accusing you of being jaded, like they could have even said it not with the tone of voice that you think they said it in. I know that's weird, right? But as soon as your mind files are referenced, everything gets tainted, right? So maybe the person accusing you of being jaded has a different definition of jaded than you do. For example, so let's say that they, like to them, jaded is like, so maybe they believe that only a certain group of people suffer from generational trauma. That's a common misconception, right? And it's also a perception that's based in guilt. And where's guilt? At the bottom of the emotional filter frequency scale, right next to shame, right? Like, let's just think about this for a sec. Think about your own family history. If you had a relative that fought in any of the world wars back in the early 1900s or lived through the Depression, which was kind of in between the two world wars, which is basically everybody, right? Because they were world wars. So there's definitely generational trauma in your family history. There's PTSD if the relative who fought in one of those wars or both was on the front lines. It doesn't even have to be world wars. It might be a more recent war. There've been lots since then, which means everybody down the line from that person learned dysfunctional coping skills as a result of somebody else's unresolved trauma. I remember years ago when addiction was the main focus of the mental health community, which is really a branch of generational trauma, isn't it? There were stats that said that for every one alcoholic, they affected 10 people negatively, or a drug addict, right? That they negatively impacted 10 people. Well, if you do the math, that means that every single person on the planet has been negatively impacted by an addict somehow. And now we understand that the addiction, whether it doesn't matter what it is, alcohol, drugs, shopping, sex, whatever, is a consequence of high levels of family dysfunction, which is related to generational trauma. In other words, there is generational trauma in every single person's life when you go back. So maybe this friend who called you jaded might not know that because maybe they didn't read a lot or learn about generational trauma, but because you chose to deal with it on your own, right? You did. Maybe the person accusing you of being jaded hasn't read about mental health at all. So how could they even know, right? Their definition of jaded might have more to do with being like with them being uncomfortable with your awareness, right? Like maybe you tripped a jealousy file. People prefer, especially their friends, to be less aware because what they're really saying is that you're not giving me the version of you that benefits me, right? Like if you're growing without them, you're leaving them behind and that's making them uncomfortable. And because they're uncomfortable, you're jaded. Or maybe the fact that you have more knowledge about something triggers jealousy in them. And their perspective is more like your clarity exposes my own naive understanding. And then that makes them uncomfortable. And because they're uncomfortable, you're jaded. Jealousy is a branch of pride, but can also be triggered by fear files, right? Because those files talk about self worth and people are always judging and comparing, right? So ultimately, everybody's mind's process is referencing the files in the filing cabinets of their mind during every single conversation. Right now, whatever I'm saying is your mind's process is finding mind files that it thinks is relational to what I'm saying. So when conversations get heated, that means that most people involved have multiple unresolved mind files. In other words, everybody's sending and receiving information through the emotional filters attached to their narratives, and the narratives are really childish wounds. So once you really kind of really understand that, once you realize that no matter who is speaking, they're sending out and receiving through either unresolved mind files or they have resolved them and they're actually vibrating at neutral and higher, right? Because when you understand that, that changes everything. You can then choose to not react. You can choose, take a deep breath, acknowledge that everybody in the conversation has just been reminded of some past hurt, and then maybe you can just say, "Oh, I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna sit this one out and try to find some compassion." Okay, that's great. So how do you do that? Well, let's say pride was the emotion that was triggered. Courage is just, look, it's just it's right above it. So it's not a stretch for you to have the courage to say, I'm going to try not to react here. And I'm going to try to move to neutral Because if you can get to neutral, you've already got it made. You've stopped the trigger right in its tracks. Even neutral can muster a little compassion for the people involved in the conversation. So your conscious thought process might be something like, okay, she thinks I'm jaded, but what does she mean by that? I know that I don't hold any resentment toward the people who abused me in my childhood because of the generational trauma they lived with or under. So I don't have to react as if she just hit me. I can choose to listen and try to figure out, try to discern what she's actually really saying to me, right? That's the thought process. So, accusations, regardless of whether somebody is suggesting that you're jaded, or maybe they're saying you're too sensitive, or you're selfish, or you're cold, or dramatic, or whatever it is they're accusing you of, remember that both of you are living the current moment through a past experience. And the narrative tied to the past experience was created long before you had the capability of understanding what actually had taken place, right? Once you get that kind of dynamic, once you understand the process, everything changes because you stop taking accusations as a verdict and you start seeing it as a signal. It's really just a signal that, hey, if I'm reacting, there's a mind file that needs to be identified and reassessed and reviewed, right? So that's it for today. Um, if the episode helped you understand your own triggers a little bit, make sure you're following along on Instagram at Penny's Mind Files and subscribe to the YouTube or Rumble channel where you can watch the visuals every time that they come up. Give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, get in the conversation. If you don't want to leave something on YouTube or Rumble, then reach out to me on social media and let me know what you think. If you're working through your own mind files and you want a little bit more support, like seriously, go back to the earlier episode because honestly, they're just going to help you understand the process that much more. So thanks for being here and thanks for doing the work because really that's how we all make the difference and be of service to others. We fix ourselves. See you next time.